So there was a pretty important story behind that tune. When I started learning how to play old-time music, and I was taking lessons from the great Tom Sauber, at the same time, there was an elder fiddler named Mel Durham. The contest stage is actually named after Mel Durham. Mel was born in 1914, and he had moved here just after World War II. He was an Illinois fiddler from a family of musicians, and he played a lot of great tunes, family tunes. But there were a couple tunes that really stood out when I was learning and listening to Mel's music. And one of them was called Over the Mountain, and another tune was called Alonzo Janes. And this fiddle tune, both of them in fact, really mesmerized me. And Mel had said that this man named Alonzo Janes, who was enslaved as a child, he was a slave, born in 1850, that he did work for the Durham family. He was a cooper, he made barrels for them, and he played fiddle, and he taught the family several fiddle tunes. And it was pretty amazing to me that I wasn't just playing an instrument, playing licks with my bow or my fingers, but I was part of a tradition. And that is really what old-time music boils down to, is we're part of this continuum. But in this particular case, I'm learning these tunes from this man, several generations older than me, who had learned some tunes from an ex-slave. And I've played and taught these tunes for years. And I've always wondered, what else is there to know about this man, Alonzo Janes? There was very little information, no photographs, nothing, and I figured that story would never develop. And one day, one of my students, who happens to be here, she's running the instrument petting zoo, she's a genealogist, Cynthia Richardson, she thought she had found descendants of Alonzo Janes and threw some feelers out. And I don't think we heard anything for about a year. And then we get this email, and there was this emotional weekend, a very emotional weekend, where these descendants heard about what was happening. They heard that there were people playing his music. And there was this weekend of emails, and they were sending me photographs, and I was starting to learn about this man. It was all coming together over a decade after I had initially learned these tunes. And they've been an important part of me as a learner and a very important part of me as a teacher. So I decided here at this festival to dedicate this stage to Alonzo Janes and the great artist and old-time musician Howard Raines, based on a photograph of Alonzo Janes, which is in your programs, drew this up, designed the stage banner, and as of today, this is officially the Alonzo Janes Performance Stage. And it's really amazing how this, for me as a musician, how this whole story has come full circle in a way. But what really makes it extra special is several descendants of Alonzo Janes are here today. They have flown in from Oregon and from Connecticut, and I'd like to welcome to the stage Dr. Gerald Jaynes, who is visiting us from Connecticut. He's a professor at Yale University. Give him a hand.
Good afternoon. And I certainly would like to thank David for keeping my great-grandfather's music going. Thank all of you for coming today. I will just tell you a few things that David and others don't know, and you'll hear as well. But I'd first like to say, you can imagine the great elation and wonderment about the internet that overcame my relatives and me when we first got in touch with David. We all knew about Alonzo Janes. Playing the violin was a family tradition. His youngest son, David Jaynes, was a pretty strong violinist himself. When I was 7 years old, they put me on the instrument. Alas, I have a great ear but no talent for the violin. So they mercifully let me get off after a couple years of agony for pretty much everybody. My sister still moans about having to listen to me practice to this day. But Alonzo Janes, David mentioned that he spent his last years in the state of Illinois, where I was born. Alonzo lived in a place called Pontiac, Illinois, and my great aunt and uncle also lived there, and we used to go over there. I was born about 20 miles away, and my father used to take us over there every couple weeks or so. And in their parlor, there was a nice piano, and on that piano was a photograph, the photograph from which the brochure today comes from. And underneath, it had just simple words: William Alonzo Janes, born a slave, Paris, Tennessee, 1850. And as a young boy, that always had an amazement for me, and I always it's when I first started thinking about slavery, when I first was able to read those words. But that's not what I want to talk about today. One of the things that I want to say is who taught Alonzo Janes to play the fiddle. Now, it turns out that Paris, Tennessee is in between Union City, Tennessee and Dresden, Tennessee. And Dresden, Tennessee is the birthplace, I believe in 1853, of Blind Joe Mangrum, who was possibly one of the most famous fiddlers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He was a regular in the early days of the Grand Ole Opry. He played the Chicago Symphony and many other places. Well, one day, William Alonzo Janes, who was a banjo player in his early youth, he was around 9 or 10 years old, was in Dresden. He ran into Blind Joe, and they became fast friends, taught each other their instruments. So William Alonzo learned his fiddle playing from Blind Joe Mangrum. If you don't know that name, you should look it up when you get a chance on the internet. The other thing about William I'd like to say, because I want you to hear the rest of this music, is that, well, he was a slave. It was illegal to teach slaves to read. So he was freed at around age 11, but at 24, he started teaching himself to read, and then he married, and he married a woman who had been free, who was actually a half Muskogee Native American and a half Scotch-Irish, and she taught him to read, and he became a consummate reader, so which is something, I guess, that fell in the genes, because the two of the adults who are here today from the family were both professors, but he taught himself, and he became a locally well-known herbalist, and which he learned from being a gardener, and he played as he tells it, he played many great balls in Tennessee and Kentucky during his youth before he moved to Illinois in governor's mansions and for the aristocracy of those states. Well, before I leave, I'd like to acknowledge my daughter, Hillary Jaynes, who should stand up in the back of the crowd, who actually his great-great-granddaughter who lives in Los Angeles. my cousin Matthew Johnson, who's come here from Eugene, Oregon, and his son Liam, who I should say is named Liam Alonzo Johnson, right? So you can see that Alonzo Janes has played a particularly important ongoing role in our family. We're still naming people after him, and we talk about him a lot. But anyway, thank you loads for being here today, and let's enjoy some more of this music.
Let's hear one more tune from Alonzo Janes. Let's welcome Chris Berry and Susan Platz.